Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. All right. Check-ins. Feel calm. Welcome to the Stoa. I'm Peter Lindbergh, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge at this moment. And yeah, we're at the knife's edge. So what's happening today? The general is here, the sense-making mensch, Jordan Hall. Phil Chen, our Game B superstar, who's going to MC the day. If you have any questions after Jordan shares his thoughts, put in the chat box. This will go on YouTube. So if you don't want to be on YouTube, ask Phil to read the question on your behalf. And that being said, I will hand it over to Phil and just make sure everyone can unmute themselves. All right, Phil, the floor is yours.
I got muted. Yeah, so just to add a little bit more details, Jordan Hall, who currently is also named Phil Chin on the screen here. I feel a little bit weird about that. He's gonna be here for an hour, and then afterwards we will have some breakout sessions also to try and sense make on what's happening today. But yeah, I'm super excited of having Jordan here, and yeah, there's so much going on in the world. I feel like culture wars are heating up again, and I'm just trying to figure out what's happening in different agendas. And the person that I was going to point to is Jordan Hall, and that's why we have him here today. And I'm super excited for that. So yeah, I wanted to pass it to Jordan and for another situational session or assessment, the Riot edition. So Jordan, what is the situation?
I'm unmuted. All right. So I noticed as I was thinking about this that there was a desire to go down into the details. And then what I realized is that's exactly the wrong approach. The right thing to do right now is to actually go way up. And even, I don't know if anybody's read the original Situational Assessment 2017 document, but if you think about the architecture of that, it described a series of fronts, and then it sort of talked at the bottom about the deep basis of in some sense, what's really going on, like the deep driver that's causing the various fronts to show up as they show up. And I believe I call it the war of collective intelligence. So let me give that as the frame, because I think that's the best way of grasping what's going on. Before I get there, I'd like to give a visual metaphor that I feel gives you a really solid sense. So I don't know if you've ever seen one of those stop motion photographs of a rotting corpse. You know, you've got a rabbit or a mouse or something sitting in the grass, and it begins to almost like vibrate, and then it upwells, and then it suddenly just disappears. That's what's happening. And now the thing that is in the process of decay is the coherence that was constructed back in the mid-century, which I named the Blue Church. So the Blue Church is dead, and the Blue Church is in the process of decay. And that decay will show up as something like a fractal war, not a civil war, because the basis for any kind of conflict is some level of coherence, right? If you have any conflict is obviously between two kinds of beings, two kinds of coherent organizations of some sort. Right now, the problem is that the ability to even achieve any level of coherence is falling. So coherence is decreasing across the entire field. And then there's a continuous upwelling of efforts to achieve some level of coherence in that process. And then those forces end up engaging with each other through all the different domains of conflict that can happen. So if you imagine a biological organism, and then imagine there's structure, like it's actually holding up, like it's maybe a horse that's holding up a weight. Then you imagine the process of decay. So like there are structural forces that you'll see them move or fall because the underlying coherence that had been supporting them, that was part of their underlying assumption that they needed to have to function, is itself actually decaying. And so you'll see structural stuff move. And that's very salient. It's sort of very easy to see like a banking collapse, like, oh my gosh, a banking collapse, or, buildings burning on the street and things like that. But that's actually a surface effect of a big chunk of actual substructure happening at the level of the coherent dynamic that is losing its capacity to be a weight-bearing load. But of course, the superficial effect is not meaningless. It's very important because it actually creates and accelerates the other dynamics in the larger system. So at the end of the day, we all definitely care about bullets and buildings as much as we care about the subtle stuff that's going on. But so if you can hold that metaphor, I think that will help, at least to help me get to a level of clarity. So to kind of recapitulate, to make sure we're more or less in a shared space, the notion is that since 75,000 years ago, humans have been seeking, by necessity, mechanisms of achieving a form of coherence. And I'll explain a little bit more, like a simple way of what I mean by that. A form of coherence that can satisfy three basic characteristics. One is that it can form a stable interiority, meaning it can actually hold itself as coherent with some number of people. It can have a population that is coherent together. The second is that it can do so effectively in the context of nature, meaning that it can actually effectively extract resources from nature that can maintain the livingness of the various elements of its coherent humanness. And then third is it can maintain its stability vis-a-vis other coherent groups of humans out in the world, sometimes known as war. And there's been a continuous competitive evolution on that particular landscape now for several tens of thousands of years, and each kind of phase of that work changes the characteristics of what's possible. The innovation of certain kinds of technologies might change the scope of the number of people that could be actually entrained under a different field of coherence. So the invention of, say, mass media and long-scale train, ship, and aircraft transportation gives rise to the possibility of actually having something like the post-war nation state. So coming into the end of World War II, we entered into the field of coherence that I called the Blue Church. And so that has a particular set of structural characteristics to it. It has the capacity, and it shows up both as itself, the thing I would call the Blue Church proper, which is the Anglo-American specific version of that form, as well as copies. So the Japanese structure is a slightly different variation on the theme, and is also connected to the more fundamental Anglo-American structure. The German structure, the EU as a form, kind of a variation and mutation on that theme as well. So, and that has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of a field of coherence is that it more or less is able to exit most of the forms of conflict that we would see among sort of squabbling humans from its interiority under the mechanisms of order and policing. And by order, what I mean is people will choose to do things like engage in transactions or just kind of like yell at each other across the fence rather than escalating into higher levels of conflict. And policing is that when higher levels of conflict do emerge, in this case, the state has the capacity to deploy asymmetric power to extinguish that conflict, which of course has all kinds of slippage and disproportionate effects across the social field. But net, there's a stability, an inability of any particular subset of groups to exit meaningfully or to defect catastrophically. And of course, the disadvantages are that it has a particular distribution. Right? It has a certain signature characteristic that creates a niche. It creates an internal ecosystem that creates winners and losers of certain sorts based upon a wide variety of characteristics that have to do with the specifics of that particular moment. Its technological characteristics, its historical path dependencies, its even its geographic characteristics. Okay, so we then move into a moment where the deep basis, the primary mechanisms that maintain the integrity of that particular kind of coherence, that stuff starts to actually break down. And there's sort of three primary reasons. One is, for example, a change at the level of techne. So the possibilities of technology shift enough that the things that had been both necessary and sufficient, like for example, broadcast television's capacity to create a shared meta-narrative, suddenly find themselves no longer necessary nor sufficient. Right? The internet's capacity to decimates that effort to create a controlled shared meta-narrative and generate a very large number of micro-narratives that can now actually, in fact, outcompete the meta-narrative's efforts to create here's the one story of what is true. So that's one example. And then, of course, you can kind of identify all the different vectors of technology that exist. Pick your poison. The second is corruption, of course, which we're experiencing ad nauseum. So, and in the context of corruption, the metaphor of like when you land at Heathrow Airport and you see how dirty it is, and you see how hard it is to maintain well-functioning, complicated systems in the context of actual lived complexity over any period of time. Right? It's atherosclerosis, what I mean by corruption. I don't necessarily mean just judges taking bribes or dirty cops. Or what I mean is the whole milieu of ways that the mechanisms that maintain the operating machinery of the sociology, which are all complicated systems, begin to develop parasites on top of them, or deviations in how they function, generate entropy that generates an increasing level of ripples out into the larger environment. And by the way, requires more and more energy to work, like an old car engine that's kind of leaking oil and has busted valves. So then the third is just obsolescence. Obsolescence has to do with the degree to which the total systemic dynamics that enabled that particular coherence to provide well functioning vis-a-vis those three, remember, interior, nature, and exterior, is no longer actually adequate to the environment that it finds itself in. Right? Either there's a superior competitor out in the environment that's now banging on the outside of the boundary. So for example, in the context of the Roman coherence back in the 3rd century AD, the various Germanic tribes had been evolving their own capacities for coherence and war making to the point where the actual effectiveness of the Roman legions reached a tipping point where its ability to survive against the exterior was no longer adequate. And you had a kind of a catastrophic popping event, and the barbarian invasions began to just pour through. Obviously, that was also tied to things like corruption, but you can just look at the obsolescence piece. Or you have things like the velocity of communication that's available in a digital networked environment operates at such a faster pace than legal processes developed in the 1950s can operate, that the old system of endeavoring to legislate and regulate literally just can't keep up. And that's another example of obsolescence. So one or more of those three characteristics, and generally all of them, emerge, and eventually there's a tipping point, and the old coherence begins to break down. And in the meantime, of course, what ends up happening is there becomes to be a struggle for what would be just the resources, the energy, literally the human beings, which is, say, the creativity, the generativity, and the productivity, the application of labor, into new kinds of coherence that are now that are looking for a new kind of stability. So if you take that whole story and you kind of look at the various lenses that I provided in the situational assessment document, you'll notice that each one of those fronts was really just a lens at looking at that story. Right? So if you looked at geopolitics, if you look at that lens, you can see, oh, okay, there's this unconventional warfare meta dynamic that is just the water, right? It's where we've lived since mutually assured destruction pushed conflict into the fractal level. And of course, that's ongoing, right? So right now, one of the things that is happening is that the level of unconventional warfare is escalating significantly. Right? So to pick the folks that Philip and I are apparently closely related to, China is very active in unconventional warfare right now at a high level. Like they're much more so than they have been in the recent past, because now is an opportunity space. Like lots of chaos is happening inside their primary global adversary, and so nudging that through traditional and conventional is kind of an odd paradox, but through unconventional warfare techniques is happening, full stop. And by the way, it's not, just China. In some sense, it's by definition, every agent who has the capacity to exercise power at the global or at the geopolitical level is playing that game, must play that game, and must play that game at maximum speed, right? It's always total war. And so you can look at the geopolitical level, and then you can zoom in and say, okay, let's take a look at it inside what would ostensibly be the interiority of the United States, right? Where you see a whole bunch of different power groups, and power groups are power groups. So you've got things like the mob, and you got things like the cartels that have presence of power inside the United States. You've got things like the FBI. Inside the FBI, you've got probably 5 to 7 distinct groups that have different levels of coordination among them, that have different alliances with different meshes, both interior and exterior to the U.S. milieu. Some of which are highly corrupt. There's some subsets of the FBI that are directly in alliance with the Sinaloa cartels. Some of which are less corrupt, right, that have maybe a direct alliance with our political institutions that we would like to actually perceive as being both valid and useful. And those are in different forms of unconventional warfare. It's crucial to recognize that unconventional warfare is warfare where you want to achieve maximum effect with maximum plausible deniability. Right? If you combine those two things together, you get the kind of the efficient frontier. So the second that you can be pointed at as being the agent that is engaged in some degree of hostility, you've lost that move. The degree to which you can have maximum impact on the world and maximum deniability, perfection. Right? So that's kind of a simple example of what that game looks like. Okay, so that's where we are. Right? We're right now in a situation where the process of the decay of the sets of coherence that were held together by the Blue Church and all of its different modalities are accelerating through what appeared to have been a perturbation, like a major perturbation effect vis-a-vis COVID. Remember that? That was the thing a couple of months ago. That shifted things a lot, but of course that's predictable, right? You're going to have 5 and 6 sigma events. It's just that they're less probabilistically, they don't happen all the time. They happen every once in a while. But we had a 5-ish sigma event in the context of the coronavirus and our collective response to the coronavirus, right? So the event is the whole complex, which pushed a lot of like undifferentiated energy through the sets of the whole fractal domain, like the macro, the micro, all these different subsets, raised a lot of like, for example, was it never let a good crisis go to waste? Well, that phrase was echoed in sort of like every center of power at every fractal level in the world simultaneously on April 1st. And of course, what that means is that the amount of chaos increases as everybody leaps forward to figure out how to play the cards that they've been holding back. Which of course breaks down other kinds of structure, right? Because war has a high entropic consequence, and then eventually, in this particular case, one of the places where the energy spilled out was in the context of civil society, right? So the kind of the kindling that we had seen catch and burn a little bit in the periods around sort of 2018 and 2019. I think like Portland had a couple of Charlottesville had a couple, like that kind of kindling was out there. And, again, in some sense, a random and predictable event occurred that was created enough energy to then catch the fuel that was in the ambient environment, and it spread through that modality. And okay, so then where are we now? What happens next? So now I'm going to zoom down a little bit to the particular modality that you guys decided to code name this particular event, the riots. And it's, in some sense, it's very simple. It either fizzles out or it escalates. Most likely it fizzles out, which is to say that there's no particular place for that energy to go that is linear. The notion of protest, like political protest, like organizing and marching and sort of shouting and carrying signs, is a fully captured political activity. Like from the period of the 50s to the late 70s, it was an innovation that had effectiveness, maybe even earlier, Gandhi and whatnot. But by the time you got to the early 80s, it was a impotent structure. And then by the time you got to the 90s, it was in fact a captured structure. So if I'm in part of the primary Blue Church control mechanism, what I want to do whenever I run into a a political competitor is I want to push that energy into protest, right? I want the sort of anti-globalist protesters in Seattle to kind of like do their thing, because it allows that energy to be released in kind of like a barbaric yelp, but to actually be very dissipated. It converts a laser beam into a flashlight. And it enables the control scheme to continue to operate with sort of the minimum amount of necessary change, which is very little. In fact, mostly just rhetorical. So there's not a whole lot of practical effectiveness that's associated with the particular agentic strategy or modality of protests, and even less so obviously with riots. There's sort of just very high random energy. But that high random energy, of course, could catch fire to something sideways. So most likely they fizzle out, having changed things that they change. One area that I think is quite likely, and it should be looked at, is the degree to which what I would call, or not what I would call, what are those people call the integral people coined a term called the green meme. And the exiting of consciousnesses from the modalities of the green meme, which is to say, okay, that thing is done, and its distributions of interpretation and agentic modes is no longer meaningfully effective. Therefore, if I've been operating under that, I will exit it. So the exit of those who are entrained to the green meme to someplace else, which I expect will probably be biased towards simply being effective, is one of the more fundamental characteristics of what I think we could expect to have happen. By the way, the implications of that are complex, like very difficult to predict exactly where that energy goes and what the consequences are. Sideways, which would then show up as escalation, would be something like almost like a copycat innovation. So some new innovation shows up somewhat randomly, but the innovation is a structural change, which then is perceived and then generates a line of copying that kind of follows, in evolutionary theory we call a ridgeline in a niche. An example, I think, that would be a very concrete example would be, imagine if you had, so three images that I've seen recently. One image is the National Guard marching through a neighborhood, I think in Minnesota, and firing riot control rounds at people sitting on their porches. The other image is just whatever, standard image of rioters kind of running amok and the police being blown away, like not stopping it. And then a third image, which I think I saw yesterday, was like 2 days ago, was like a bunch of people in the suburbs who'd like pulled their trucks like to close the opening to their gated community and were standing out front of it with guns. Right. So imagine, and I'm not necessarily, by the way, saying that this is a good thing. I'm just saying this would be an escalation, because it would be an innovation that would then definitely be copied. So imagine a circumstance where there's an escalation of the entropic energy of the riots, meaning that the capacity of the control structure to inhibit that violence by overcoating it with its own state-sponsored violence shows ineffectiveness. So the riots spread, and they spread into the suburbs out of the cities. And there's a autochthonous move by the people inside those suburbs to defend themselves. Remember the Koreans on the rooftops during the Rodney King riots, and they're successful, right? So there's like not just sort of peaceful protesters walking by and a bunch of people with guns, but in fact violent rioters rushing and a bunch of people with guns, and they meet, right? And then in that meeting, in that moment of meeting, it kind of doesn't matter where it goes. That moment would be an escalation event, because whatever happens there would begin to percolate through the systems and create an innovation cycle, like an arms race, actually specifically an arms race. How far that particular sub thing would burn, I don't know, but there's a lot of fuel in that particular one. A separate or somewhat distinct escalation event might be something like what are called a police riot. This happened in the 60s, I think, either Detroit or Chicago, where you might imagine like New York, you could see something like this happening in New York, where the police slipped the leash of their political control. Right? So the mayor says stand down, and the police escalate, right? And in fact just go to town and deploy police power, now no longer constrained by the political authority that had been involved. And this has happened, right? It happens somewhat often in history, and has happened in American history several times. And that, of course, would be another massive escalation, because one of the things that's happening primarily right now is separation vertically in the levels of the what we might call legitimate or expected authority. So during coronavirus, for example, where the states pulled away from federal authority and began to form coalitions. I think that we got like 6 or 7 distinct coalitions that had been say, fuck the feds, we're going to do this ourselves in the way that we agree to mutually among each other. And that's a breaking of vertical power. And then equally, if you had like certain counties in California went to the governor and said, fuck your quarantines, we're opening up right now. Right? So another breaking of vertical power. And so obviously police breaking with mayors would be a breaking of vertical power. And that's an important one, because that kind of dynamic, that kind of pulling generates a lot of chaos, because vertical power is structurally very difficult to replace. Okay, that feels like that was a lot of words. Maybe we can recohere.
All right, awesome, Jordan. So yeah, I'm going to announce to everybody that we're going to be moving to the Q&A session. So if you guys have questions, please drop it into the chat now. Just a reminder, these questions are recorded, so if you don't want to be on video and be uploaded to YouTube, then you can let me know if you want me to read that question. And I'm going to kickstart it off. In a sense, yeah, I think I had a very similar question to what Christian was asking. I think Daniel Schwackenberg at the Rebel Wisdom Festival talked about the elections coming up in November, and how either way, potentially 50% of the population may actually figure out that this whole thing was rigged afterwards. So I'm wondering, like, what is the interaction of what's happening now with the elections that are coming up in 5 months?
Yeah, so it's pretty clear that the November elections are going to be another a perturbation point. There's just too much that's going to happen in that context, and therefore, by the way, a huge amount of energy is being focused on that particular moment. So, in terms of unconventional warfare, it's through the roof at all levels. So one thing is for sure, those elections are going to be rigged. Now they may be rigged actually in a fashion which they're still real. There may be kind of enough counter pressures to hold them together. I personally doubt it, but this is not a place that I have a lot of deep expertise or like insight. I'm kind of talking to a lot of people who are looking at it more closely. So let me give a little clarity what I mean by that. In the context of unconventional warfare, one of the very first things that you try to go after when you're destabilizing a nation state, if that nation state happens to be, a democratic republic, is you go after the elections. And when you go after the elections, your best result is to own the elections and have them look legitimate. That's your best result. Right? So if you can actually cause the population to continue to believe that they're in a democracy when in fact they're not, you control what happens. The second best result is to have them be illegitimate and therefore break down the capacity of the governance system to operate. Right? So that would be the objective of any agency that's trying to destabilize any democratic republic. Okay, well, clearly our particular electoral system is sort of with its jugular exposed to that kind of an attack. And that kind of attack is sort of being pressed right now. And that's very important to remember. Like I don't know if you guys recall, there's this whole sort of notion of the Russians interfering with the election back in 2016. And the answer is of course, and everyone else was too. But it's important to recognize that in the context of interfering with the elections, if I'm the Russians, I'm more interested in destabilizing the polity than I am in necessarily trying to get a particular agent on board, unless I happen to really, really own a particular agent, which happens sometimes, but not that commonly in a large context. So that's one thing. Second thing is to recognize that the elections are multi-layered. Right? So we sometimes, and I think this is, by the way, a massive judo error, sometimes collapse the election to the election of the chief executive. And so we say, oh, that's the election. But in point of fact, like the dog catcher is also going to be elected on that same ballot. And a lot of the local elections are actually more important because they have a lot more subtle, important power. So gaming or shifting or reshaping the legitimacy of the presidential election is one piece, but actually to the degree to which you can actually own things like, police commissioners, county commissioners, sheriffs, that kind of thing, then you're really getting into the kind of the metabolism, not just the kind of the brain center of a democratic republic. So in that context, what I would say is, at least from my perspective, it's kind of funny, there's 100% certainty that the presidential election will be illegitimate. I mean, it's already baked in. I don't think anybody believes that either of the candidates is vaguely legitimate. And so no matter what happens, it's already that's done. It's almost like the work of making that illegitimate was baked in at least months ago, and probably longer. Now, and then, so once you say like, geez, whoever wins, everybody's like, what the hell just happened there? And by the way, I mean, everybody, nobody's happy either way, except for a very tiny fraction of people. So then the bigger question is, and also, is there a capacity and desire to point at and generate a cognitive dissonance armored story around the full illegitimacy of the election, right? The full rejection. Right? So one is kind of like a passive, oh, this is definitely not legitimate. The other one is stepping forward. And it's less about the degree to which the election is illegitimate and more about the degree to which there is a coherent capacity to organize an adequate number of effective people to actually promote that really into the world. That's definitely going to happen. I mean, there's definitely going to be a competition to see if that occurs. And it remains to be seen whether or not that kind of level of coherence is possible right now. Then you have the things that are going on deeper. And I think that you can almost like put it as, you can kind of collapse that whole sphere into more or less two states. One state is, is the pyramid solid, but the top is kind of wobbly. The other state is, do you invert it and the whole pyramid is wobbly? If there's a very deep felt sense that the whole election process, like the notion that the democracy itself is no longer functional, then you've entered into a massive phase transition. If not, if there's still a deep felt sense that it's still a struggle to figure out how to win through roughly ordinary politics, then we're sort of still where we are, and the decay continues across all dimensions. Okay, I hope that was somewhat useful in the context of that question.
Sure. I think a lot of people think of just the presidency, but a lot of the local elections are where a lot of the power is gained. So
civilizational consequences. All right, so that's the other piece of it. Just think about in terms of the bigger picture, like the bigger story. Oh Jesus, let's see. Well, let me back up. Obviously, one of the things that's happening here is I am largely presenting my frame, right? So to the degree which that's helpful, great. To the degree which it's not helpful, just throw it away. So within the context of my frame, we are very much in a moment of civilization level transition. And in fact, I think I've said it publicly a few times, from my perspective, we're like at the moment of the transition at the level that gave rise to civilization as a thing. So we're not like going from Rome to the Middle Ages. We're going from pre-agriculture to agriculture or more. Right? And in that context, it is actually, I think, the case that if we end up with the election scenario where the whole pyramid is wobbly, I said a major phase transition, I think we will have moved a lot into that place. So the liminal war will have become much higher, because to the degree to which the blue church control structure now read globally, right? The capacity of the blue church, which by the 90s had entrained the entire world, right? The entire world was entrained to the blue church, to the degree to which that control structure is in fact effectively gone, right? If the United States falls into a kind of a liminal free fall, then everything's up for grabs at a global level. And the crisis, the don't let a good crisis go to waste mindset that had happened in coronavirus will now happen all the way. And it is my perspective right now, is kind of looking at it, and it's been my perspective for a decade, that at that moment, the system bifurcates. Right? Either a new coherence finds a way to emerge that can actually hold all the energy that's in the current environment, which, by the way, is a whole lot, right? Post-nuclear. Or there's just a series of what are called ripstop breaks, right? Where just things continue to break. And I don't really know where the bottom of that is, but it's pretty deep. As far as I've thought about that a lot, I don't see any natural place where that stops. We can go into that as well. But yes, I think that a full destabilization of the blue church in the context of a completely demoralized election in November begins what I would call the end game, like the full movement into the liminal war.
Yeah, I'm feeling a little bit sad and scared. I want to bring in, just to talk about maybe some positive direction. I want to bring in Travis Mann. Earlier question around maybe
Thanks, Phil.
something. Yep.
So Jordan, in your assessment, are there any plausible scenarios where the US/the world makes it out of our current situation of like continuing escalation and authoritative crackdowns to another era of like internal peace and cooperation? Or do you really feel like all of the plausible scenarios have this ship just going down?
No, I think there are a few, well, two plausible scenarios that are in what we would consider sort of the upside. And what's interesting is that one of the plausible scenarios is somewhat temporary, in the sense that it's kind of like the post-war situation, where it forms a form of coherence that, by the way, will feel really good and generative, and will have a lot of there will be kind of a golden age, but it doesn't last that long. Like this has to do with a meta theory of the way that time is more a matter of bandwidth than it is of fixed moments. And so basically, as the bandwidth goes up, the period of objective time, like numbers of times the Earth goes around the sun, decreases in the lifespan of a particular complicated civilization structure. So there's likely one kind of major upgrade at this civilization structure level that is a complicated civilization structure that is plausible. And it'll look something like Neil Stephenson's files concept. And it'll be non-geographic, values coordinated, virtuality mediated aesthetic files, which are sort of coordinated structures that have some level of interoperability between them that inhibits significant conflict between them. Something like that, like something along that sort of sensibility. And by the way, now I'm sort of using a whole bunch of different theories to sort of generate a very rough estimate, but that has maybe a 25-year timeline to it. So it's it'd be weird. Like it'll grow and then suddenly be no longer vital and then disappear in like one human generation. The second path is this sort of what's called a portal pathway in evolutionary theory, which is single cellular organisms, multicellular organisms. And then suddenly, a multicellular organism happens on the same landscape as single cellular organisms. But once it happens, it creates a whole new dynamic, right? It's a single one-way trip. And now, we all multicellular organisms are literally a kind of single cellular organism, a particular kind, but now it becomes its own subset. So the other plausible path is a portal pathway to a different domain that is as different from the domain of what I've called Game A, which is to say the sum total of all possible civilizations post-agriculture, as that was from the hunter-gatherer method, right, which I've called Game B. So that is another plausible transition. And the probability of that has not decreased at all, because everything that's happening right now is sort of baked in, like this is what it was going to look like. And that, I haven't seen anything happen that strikes me as being catastrophically reducing possibility space in that particular domain. Like there's, lots of moves back and forth, some positive, some negative, but it's kind of still more or less in the same stream. And the probability, in my estimation at least, is not very high, but it's important to recognize that any mechanism of endeavoring to think about that is using toolkits that come from our existing set of models, which means that they can't really be considered particularly valid. We have to look at them with a lot of skepticism. So it is definitely the case that I can identify that as being a plausible scenario using our current models, but I can't say a whole lot more than that.
Thanks.
And I should mention as a corollary, as far as I can tell, all other scenarios are short-lived and collapse rather rapidly.
I'm seeing Jermaine has a lot of upvotes recently. So Jermaine, if that's how you say your name, can you unmute and ask your question?
Thanks. Yeah, Jermaine Malcolm.
Hold on, I don't see you. Hold on, let me switch this so I can see your face.
Some of you might see me as Jermaine Marvel, or know me as Jermaine Marvel, sorry. Let me find my question. Yeah, the question is, to what extent is American racial frictions a symbol of the underlying problem ailing America? And to what extent is the Blue Church a colonial project, colonialism being a pervasive game A tech?
Right, sorry. Would you say that again? I take it you're a non-video participant.
I wasn't very clear. I wasn't very clear at all. To what extent are American racial frictions a symbol of the underlying problem ailing America? And to what extent is the Blue Church a colonial project, colonialism being a pervasive game A tech?
Completely on both counts. But that does not exhaust the totality of what they are. So the Blue Church is a colonial project, colonialism being fundamental to game A. Like in some sense, the whole point of game A was, how does my interiority consume all exteriorities that are adjacent to it? It is a totalizing, game A is a totalizing game, full stop. And then racial tensions are actually a deeper basis, having to do with the fact that we had a genetic diaspora, and our particular bands and sub-tribes operating in the pre-agricultural environment generally tended to spread out and and not interconnect very much, which generated things like different subcultures and different languages. And then the ability to form cosmopolitanism was dealt with in one mechanism in the pre-agricultural environment, and a different mechanism in the post-agricultural environment. And the solution to the problem of heterogeneity in the context of coherence has a solution set in game A. Many different variant efforts to try to solve that particular set of problems. And none of those particular solution sets are stable.
All right, thanks, Jordan. Amy, can you unmute and ask your question?
Oh, hi. I didn't expect to actually be unmuted. Hi, Jordan. I just wanted to ask to what extent you think, or potentially think, that the image dissemination is an aspect of unconventional warfare, or are there other aspects of unconventional warfare that you can talk about?
The image dissemination? You're muted.
I have to look back at my question. I'm sorry. It was a while since I wrote this. Hold on one sec. Sorry about that. Can you speak on the current media cycle of image dissemination as a potential aspect of unconventional warfare?
Got it. Okay. So there's, you could think of it as maybe a tension between conventional warfare and unconventional warfare. So as a mechanism for producing a dominant narrative during the late 20th century, we might consider that to be conventional warfare. And you could see, for example, the eruption or the interruption of a dominant narrative during the Vietnam era, and then the scrambling effort to actually generate effective mechanisms to control that and maintain a dominant narrative during the latter part of the Vietnam era, and then the rest of the 20th century. That's conventional warfare. And so that's a primary mechanism of the Blue Church control structure, is to sort of own the image and to present that image repeatably and with consistency. Now, in the context of the possibility of generating alternative images, and in fact, this actually has a fork on it. There's the ability to create what you might call counter images or different narratives, which of course in the context of the internet becomes willy-nilly, right? The capacity to plug that dike becomes almost impossible, and images of all sorts can now flow into the collective visual field. And by the way, also at a higher pace of evolution, which is crucial. It's not just number, but it's also the ability to iterate them in a fashion which is outside of the control structure of Blue Church mechanisms. So that's one vector, and that's that can be shaped, and it can and will be shaped by any kind of agent that's endeavoring to use mechanisms of unconventional warfare. So it is it's part of the basic toolkit. Like if I go into Yemen, one of the things that I'll do is I'll begin the process of endeavoring to generate different kinds of images. And by the way, doing lots and lots of them and finding the ones that stick and then upregulating those. Like it's an evolutionary approach in that mode. And so of course, if I'm doing that in the US or Japan, I'll do the same thing. And to the maximum extent possible, what I'll do is actually try to enlist autochthonous groups in the local cultural milieu who will have a much richer sensibility around what will actually work in the local environment. Find ones that have expressions that I feel at least generally tend to shape things in my preferred direction, and then upregulate those. So that's the way that normally works. But then also remember the other side, which is just pure chaos. Right? So in unconventional warfare, I either want to sort of get things to go my way, or I want to destabilize things. Either one is a pretty good result. And so to just generate pure chaos is useful. And literally, if all I can do is just jack people's attention system and jerk people's attention system around so they can't actually engage in coherent, effective choice making, then again, at the unconventional warfare level, I've done a pretty good job. Did that respond to your question in any meaningful way? Okay.
Sorry about that. My internet cut off. I am a little unsure of what's happening now. I hear there's some silence.
The last conversation ended and we were waiting for you to do something else. Or alternatively, Peter was inviting us into a moment of silence without saying anything, which is a very commonplace move for him.
I like that move.
I got a question, Phil.
Yeah, I was going to be like, go ahead, Pierre.
Yeah, okay. So Jordan, you suggested that previously to Phil and I about having sort of like sense-making sessions here at the Stoa with experts, where we get different experts together to kind of sense-make, a certain issue. And we're also thinking of having sense-making town halls that we can kind of like prototype here at the Stoa that could be used in a local setting via Zoom or something like akin to it. And like a Stoic news channel where we kind of like sense-make news items. So I just, do you have any advice or any thoughts?
Yay, David Jones. I said the same thing. So that is not what I suggested. It's the exact opposite of what I suggested. Almost the perfect inverse. What I suggested was a practice whereby a group of people did two things simultaneously. On the one hand, there was a probably asynchronous and probably text-based effort to engage in a collective inquiry, to discern the questions that seem to be the most meaningful, right, which would take over a period of time. So imagine in this particular chat, there was actually an ongoing conversation and some mechanism among the entire group to say, okay, here are the set of questions that are the most meaningful. That's one piece of the story. The other piece of the story would then be to enlist from the body, from the group, and potentially from the whole population, who do we collectively sense are those who would have the highest quality sense making around this particular set of questions. Right? So and what I mean by that, the key of that is much less the result of the interaction. So let's just say by hypothesis, somebody mentioned the portal. So let's say by hypothesis, a set of questions came up, and there was like, yeah, this really feels weighty and heavy. And then in that process, there was also and I'd really like to see sort of Eric Weinstein and, Slavoj Zizek have a conversation about it. Like, that feels like that's the marriage made in heaven. Yes, that could be super cool and interesting, but much more important is the cultivation of discernment around those two different activities that's happening in every distinct individual. Right? So the discernment of where is the directionality in my social field of high quality sense making in this domain, right? Because that needs to be cultivated. Like, to whom will you go to get better sense making in a particular meaningful location is a primary capacity for any possible future state. Like, building that into the network. Each person has to have a capacity to know what are the valid nodes, like what are the places where the richness of the sense making is very, very high, like highest gradient nutrition in terms of sense making. And by the way, it's always going to be outside of you by definition. That's the whole point of this thing, right? Collective sense making is always that. So, and it's never going to be completely flat. Well, sometimes it might be completely flat. It might be this thing is so chaotic that in fact the best answer is just to grab a bunch of random people and just see what happens. But in many cases, there are people for whom a particular domain is in fact a place where their life arc has put them in a place where their insight is deep. They have wisdom in that domain, and to know that, to be able to grok that and sense that and call them into their place of wisdom to share that wisdom is a primary activity. Then the inverse of that is that in every given node, there needs to be a capacity to have a sensing into reducing the noise in yourself and orienting towards the most meaningful. Right? Every individual must always be working. This is the movement from salience to relevance in Vervaeke's language, right? So the collective practice of working together to increase our individual and collective capacity to move into what is most meaningful and not constantly get distracted by our salience landscaping, which sort of grabs the shiniest object, mostly rhetorically, but actually be able to settle and say, okay, yeah, that actually is a fucking important question. That's a place that's worth spending some time and energy on. If we get that piece with more clarity, then we can actually make a solid step forward, right? Meaningfulness as one vector, and then wisdom as another vector. That was what I proposed as a useful thing for you guys to spend some time on.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. And I used Eric Weinstein and Zizek as examples, but it probably won't look, ideally it will stop looking like that, right? That's an artifact of a broadcast modality. Right? The notion that you have names that you know, and they have some number of followers greater than 10,000 is an artifact of a topology that is definitely not effective in terms of collective intelligence. So what we would want this thing to evolve into over time is a situation where it's a much finer grained level of intimacy, and in fact probably has iterations. So you might imagine a group of 1,000 people would form clusters of 100, and out of that 100 they would actually surface from their interiority the ones who seem to be the most called to provide wisdom in a particular domain of inquiry. And then you would actually have each of those groups would then actually have interactions. So the idea is you actually want to have this be generated from within, not a pointing to this notion of expert. The idea of expert needs to be extinguished.
Very cool. There's almost a desire from my side to now almost jump into like breakout rooms and us all kind of try and do some sense making around the question of what's happening right now, especially regarding the riots, and having everybody here kind of participate in that and see where it goes. But I did want to ask you, Jordan, if you feel like you want to answer another question or any final thoughts that you may have. Or we can also do what you did last time, pick someone who we haven't seen talk before and see if they have any interesting questions for you.
Let me just quickly scroll and see if anything pops. No, it feels like everything is moving in more in the direction of breakout session. It's good.
All right. Any final thoughts before we break into the breakout session?
My final thought is I sincerely hope that this is the last time that I'm in this group. I sincerely hope that from this point forward, it is entirely happening as an evolutionary dynamic happening peer-to-peer, and that I have no particular special place. Like my name shouldn't matter.
Oh, that feels very sweet. Thank you, Jordan, for taking the time and sharing the wisdom. I appreciated the high-level view, which helped me at least ground what's happening on the day-to-day with more perspective. And I want to pass it to Peter if he has anything to say before breaking out into some breakout rooms.
Yeah, so before I stop the record, just to plug a few events this evening, we have COVID and biosecurity preparedness. That's at 6 p.m. Eastern time. It's a conversation. And then Travis Mann, he's having a session called Breaking the Frame. Travis, would you like to go off mute and just give us an idea of what that's going to look like?
Yeah, certainly. So it's very relevant to what Jordan's been talking about. So we're going to explore ways that our own narratives inside our brains have been hijacked and the kind of mechanisms by which that happens, and start to induce a healthy amount of doubt in however we're framing our understanding of the world right now. And then also give us the flexibility to occupy different perspectives so that we can discern which ones are most useful at which moment.
Beautiful. Okay, so Stoa is based off a gift economy. You can check out more of that on the website. And if you're interested in working with those unpanels with Phil and I and possibly Jordan to figure out how to kind of crack that code and get the right enabling constraints in order to make that happen, feel free to reach out to us. And we're really willing to experiment. I'm viewing this as a psychotechnology incubator here at the Stoa, so we can test, fuck up in the right way and see what works. That being said, I will stop recording and hand it over to Phil.
All right.